New Zealand.
And the Babbage Peninsula, they survive on some modern maps, as does Babbage Island, but the New South Wales Mount Babbage and Mount Lyell disappeared on maps after 99 years.
It seems if, I don't know what kind of news shows you have in New Zealand, but if you had 5 minutes on a television news show, you'd probably get more publicity than any other way of getting attention. So I can't imagine anybody throwing out a 100-year-old lithographic engraving of anybody.
Well, but to finish this particular point, below that lithographed portrait, there were the journals of Benjamin Herschel Babbage's expedition of 1856 to Central
that's
Australia.
definitely interesting.
The state archivists in South Australia, ever since the 19th century, had made several searches trying to find those journals.
So there's more than just the interest of computer historians.
Yes. And so those long-sought journals are now deposited in the State Archives in Adelaide in South Australia.
Are you ready? Are we on? Oh, that's nice to know. Okay. This is the second part of an interview. I guess I better go back. What was I?
Yeah, look at it.
What was the thing? Oh,
Look straight at this
okay.
camera, okay?
Where was I? Well, I'm just going to ask you to repeat your background very quickly again in case the first reel ever vanishes. Okay. This is the second part of an interview with Mr. T, who discovered some of Babbage's relics in New Zealand and Australia last year. Today is the 4th of January 1983. We are videotaping this at MIT in Cambridge, Mass. Why don't you just repeat quickly your 1-minute introduction of the previous tape in case we have to splice it.
Right. So I'm Gary John T. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Auckland, where I had gained my bachelor's and master's degrees. I work mainly in numerical analysis, but have a strong interest in the history of science. And in particular, I had been interested in Babbage ever since, as a schoolboy, I met the very distinguished New Zealand mathematician Leslie John Comrie when he made a return visit to New Zealand in 1948. And I learned from him that there are some descendants of Charles Babbage in New Zealand.
I'm going to start off with that last statement. Comrie did some very important work on the early British computers during World War II, on Colossus, did he not?
No, he was not involved in Colossus. From 1925 onwards until his death in 1950, he was a major, well, he was indisputably the leading figure in scientific computing. And he did not invent new machinery. He advocated employing existing machinery, and in particular, he discovered that it was possible to get the effect of Babbage's difference engines by taking existing commercial accounting machinery and perverting it to purposes never intended by its designers and manufacturers.
So he knew about Babbage right from the start.
Oh yes, and he did all that he could to publicize Babbage. In 1933, for instance, he published a long survey article entitled Modern Babbage Machines, showing how a variety of commercial accounting machines could be employed as Babbage difference engines.
What influence did he have on the early electronic computer developments?
In 1945, the Harvard Mark I was publicly announced, and there were 2 volumes about it were published, and in 1946 Comrie reviewed those first 2 volumes of the Harvard Mark I in Nature. His review has become famous. It was entitled Babbage's Dream Come True, and it was a crucial turning point in the recognition of Babbage. But he did point out that everything which the people at Harvard had, was it Harvard or MIT? Yes, at Harvard, had been thought of by Babbage 110 years previously in terms of the mechanical technology of his day, and much more besides. And I believe that it is the case, but I have not yet found documentary confirmation, that it was directly as a result of Comrie's suggestion that Howard Aiken hastily added an if statement to the Harvard Mark I, thereby converting it from a very large calculator to a very small computer.
Now, what do we know about the influence Babbage may have had on the early computer pioneers before that time, before the Harvard Symposium and the 2 volumes came out?
Well, of the principal pioneers of computing, Howard Aiken certainly had a copy of Babbage's Passages from the Life of a Philosopher, and Grace Hopper has told how on the very first day that she joined Aiken, about 1940, he urged her to read the book, which she later did, but neither of them had noticed the significance of the conditional jump, which is embedded in several pages of complicated and quite irrelevant mathematics in Babbage's published accounts. Of the other pioneers, Eckert and Macaulay emphasized in later years that they had not known of Babbage at the time that they were working on ENIAC. Conrad Zuse began working on calculating machinery about 1934, and in 1938 he tried to get an American patent on some of his ideas, but his patent lawyer did a very thorough job and advised him that he would not be able to get an American patent because similar ideas had been developed by Babbage a century previously.
What of Alan Turing? And
Turing was almost certainly familiar with Babbage by the time that he wrote his famous paper of 1936 on the Turing engines. In his work on Colossus during World War II, so far as one can determine through the thick veil of secrecy, he appears to have been consciously imitating Babbage's analytical engine with his work on cryptography using Colossus. I have no reason to believe that Flowers and Coombs, who were doing the detailed design and actually constructing Colossus, I have no reason to believe that they were familiar with Babbage's ideas.
And what of Vannevar Bush?
I would be very surprised if he did not know of Babbage's work. He was a very cultured man, and I would expect him to have known of Babbage's work. Another remarkable pioneer was G.M. Phillips, who was a lawyer and actuary by profession, and I hear that his texts on law are still consulted by lawyers. And in 1938, I think, he presented a paper at the Institute of Actuaries in which he cited that his purpose was to convert the entire human race from counting in tens to counting in eights. And so he advocated the use of binary arithmetic for mechanical computation and demonstrated a cardboard model of a binary multiplying machine. And in the discussion which followed, Comrie, who was in the audience, and Phillips engaged in a very detailed discussion of Babbage's ideas and their relevance to Phillips's proposals for using electronic circuitry with photoelectric cells operating in binary arithmetic. Phillips attempted to patent a large-scale electronic computer operating in binary, but somebody in the British government ordered the suppression of all reference to electronics from his patent application.
Why would that be?
That is a great puzzle. Who in the British Patent Office could have been sufficiently far-sighted to see that this was potentially of very great significance? So, Phillips continued in his career as a lawyer and actuary, and many years later, about 1963, he was honoured by the Institute of Actuaries in London with a gold medal for his 1938 paper on binary computation, and the Science Museum accepted from him the cardboard model of a binary multiplier, which he had demonstrated in 1938.
To get back to an earlier subject, it seems clear from the artifacts that have just begun to get surfaced that Babbage was fairly well known during the 19th century. He may have been as prominent as some of the writings that we've picked up indicated. He surely got a lot of medals and diplomas. His machines were known by a number of inventors for decades afterwards. Yet his work and his own being became so depressed in the knowledge of his own people that by 1981 some of his heirs could pick up an engraving of his, which would be worth something as an engraving alone, and try to throw it out. How could that have come about?
That was a very interesting question. Babbage was never totally forgotten. That there were, ever since his own lifetime, there have been a few people who were aware of his ideas and recognized them as being very important and tried to convince others. But his ideas have been very largely forgotten. Take another pioneer, the remarkable Percy Ludgate, working as an accountant in Dublin in the early part of this century. He devised an analytical engine, a tape-controlled 3-address calculator. And he had done much of his design before he became aware of Babbage's ideas, but then saw the resemblance between Babbage's principles and his own, although differing greatly in mechanical detail. And so in his only published paper, published in 1908 on the subject, he did call it an analytical engine and stressed the resemblance to the principles of Babbage's engine. Torres y Quevedo, in his remarkable series of automatic devices, again was very consciously developing ideas of Babbage. But to the general public, in his later years, he simply became notorious as a crank. And in particular, he probably owed much of his notoriety to his pioneering work in combating the nuisance of noise pollution. His very vigorous efforts to reduce the level of noise from itinerant bands of musicians and street organists in the 1850s and 1860s brought him much publicity, ridicule, abuse, and probably did much to make people think generally of him as a bizarre crank and eccentric. So when he died at the age of 79, and he had, ever since the 1820s, he engaged in noisy public quarrels with the political and scientific establishment in Great Britain. But with his vast wealth inherited from his father, a prosperous banker who died in 1827, he still for some decades remained a social lion in British society. But dying at the age of 79, he was mostly dismissed as an accomplished mathematician who had become a tedious crank, and that remained the standard image of him until recent years, with only a very few people continuing to be aware of his scientific ideas, particularly on his calculating engines.
What would have happened if he could have continued to work on his machines, perhaps completed them, or perhaps even his son complete them by, let's say, the 1880s, 1890s? What would have done for British technology, British engineering, British society?
That is a very interesting question. I recommend it as a topic to a knowledgeable writer of science fiction. It would have been a major historical event. I think that it would be fair to say that the computer revolution would have got underway several decades earlier than it did, and we're all well aware of the fact that we are in the midst of an unprecedented historical event, the ever accelerating revolution in many aspects of life being brought about by the exponential growth of computing in all its aspects. I think that it would have begun in the 19th century rather than in the second half of the 20th century, if Babbage or his son had succeeded in getting even a small analytical engine working. But Babbage was extremely ambitious. He was thinking of a store of 1,000 numbers of 40 or 50 decimal digits apiece.
Thank you. Okay. You want to ask any questions?
Yes, could the machine have worked? Because suppose he had gotten the funding, and he had gotten the machine to at least operate. Would it have been reliable enough? Would it have sustained operations enough to be effective?
Would it pay for you to get on camera or mic that, or should I repeat the question?
Go ahead.
Well, very detailed studies of Babbage's designs have been made recently by Anthony Hyman, and Alan Bromley at the University of Sydney is engaged in a long-term project. And both of them are of the opinion that Babbage could probably have brought it off. He did bring about such enormous advances in engineering, design and technology in his attempts to build the machines that if he had had financial backing, and if he had been able to devote himself uninterruptedly to the development of the engines, it seems probable that he could have got the engines working with the mechanical technology of his day. You must remember that the analytical engine did involve some hundreds of thousands of cogwheels, simply to store the numbers in the store and mill of the engine, quite apart from the ancillary machinery. So it would have been about the size and weight of a small railway locomotive, and would have needed a steam engine to wind up the weight whose fall was intended to actually drive the engine. But Babbage was a brilliant engineer who had a team of really first-rate engineers working with him. He designed his machine, he invented very sound engineering principles, every single moving part locked into position before completing the transmission of its movement to the next part of the machine.
How long would it have taken to translate it into electrical form, using relays at first, perhaps? Or something like a Stroger switch, which would have imitated his cogwheels? Would that have come quickly? Could that have come quickly? Could Babbage have anticipated that?
That's a very difficult question to answer. The people who did build the first working computers, they had the advantage of 110 years of technological advance. So most of the early computers or proto-computers were assembled out of electrical and electronic components which were being mass-produced for telephone exchanges, radio receivers and transmitters, etc. And in particular, the switching mechanism in the Harvard Mark I was multipole switches being mass-produced for telephone relays. The designers of the first working computers, proto-computers, had a much more highly developed technological base to work on.
Was there sufficient need for a machine in, let's say, 1880 that could have brought in enough money to continue advancing? Or would it have been?
There certainly was, but Babbage, with his public quarrels with the scientific and political establishment, had formed many enemies in high places, and in particular the Astronomer Royal, George Biddle Airy, in the 1820s onwards, persistently ridiculed the idea there was any need for such large-scale calculation. Similarly, when the Schweitzers exhibited their difference engine in Paris at an exhibition in 1855, although Babbage managed to persuade the commissioners to award a gold medal to the Schweitzers, Leverrier, as director of the Paris Observatory, refused to consider accepting a machine to do the work of the Paris Observatory.
Sounds like the salesman would have had a lot of trouble in those days, trying to convince people to use it. Are there any other questions?
Okay, go ahead. You can say anything. We'll just cut that out, I guess.
Okay.
All right, that's it, Larry.